Hello, everyone, and welcome. I'm Rabbi Julia Andelman, Director of Community Engagement here at JTS, and I'm pleased to welcome you to today's session of our Fall Learning Series to our Better Than One, Friendship in Jewish Text, Thought, and Life. A special welcome to anyone joining us for the first time, and you can find previous sessions on the series page that was in the reminder email that you received today. We're so pleased to welcome today one of our adjunct professors, Dr. Aaron Kohler, who, in addition to teaching as an adjunct at JTS, is a full-time professor of Near East Studies at Yeshiva University, and we love bringing you the full diversity of our faculty in this program. His session is entitled, "Do Good Fences Make Good Neighbors?" ? A Talmudic Teaching, and he will be exploring what we owe people outside of our inner circles. So a question that's pressing now and all the time, but now in new ways, I suppose. We don't have a sponsor today, but if folks are inspired by this wonderful learning with JTS scholars, we would love for you to consider sponsoring a future session. We have multiple sponsorship levels, and we're putting a link to the chat where you can learn more about that. I'll now turn it over to Tani Schwartz-Herman.
Thank you, Rabbi Andelman. So just to review the format of today's session, Professor Kohler will pause for questions periodically throughout the session. We'll have some time for Q&A at the end as well. You can use the chat feature to submit your questions to Rabbi Julia Andelman, and during the Q&A period, she will select a few of the questions to present to Dr. Kohler. Since we receive a large number of questions, we would appreciate it if you could express your question both clearly in complete sentences and also concisely. For any technical or logistical questions, please initiate a private chat with either myself or Ellie Gettinger. The sources for today's class were in the email that you received earlier today. We'll be screen sharing them as well. So pleased to introduce Dr. Aaron Kohler, Adjunct Professor of Talmud at JTS and Professor of Near Eastern Studies at Yeshiva University. He is the author of Unbinding Isaac, the Akedah for Jewish Thought, and Esther and Ancient Jewish Thought, among other books, and the co-editor of 5 more. He is currently working on the cultural history of the alphabet from its invention through world domination. I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to you, Dr. Kohler.
Thank you very much. It's great to be here. I'm actually in JTS, so when I say it's great to be here, I actually mean something physical by that, even though it's great to be on the screen with you all as well. I'm going to share my screen in a moment and work through a text from the Talmud together, but I want to give a bit of a framing to what I'm trying to do more methodologically and programmatically, besides the specific text and points, ideas that we'll see. The Talmud, as I think I'll probably be saying things that are familiar to you, but the Talmud has a different way of talking than we usually use in our own discourse and our own culture. Also interested in values and ideas and principles and what happens when there's a clash of values. As Rabbi Andelman said, ask a big question. What are our obligations to people outside of our immediate circle? That's a big question. It's a question that the Talmud struggles with the same way that we all struggle with it. But instead of writing an op-ed piece or a philosophical treatise or an essay or a speech, the Talmud has a sugya. A sugya is a little bit tough to define, but it's a woven together discussion. Some legal teachings, some stories, questions and answers, suggestions that are rejected or accepted. And one of the points that's sometimes easy to miss in Talmud is that law is often something other than actually about law. This is true in our law as well. When we write laws, and there's a reason that these are sometimes very contentious, that laws encode values. Laws provide hierarchies. Laws provide incentives to do one thing or disincentives to do something else. Even things like our tax codes, right? Our tax code, the United States tax code, values home ownership and marriage and philanthropy of certain types. And these are things written into law. So when you sit down to decide, what should our tax code give breaks for, you're really asking, well, what kind of spending do we want to encourage in our society? And what kind of spending do we not want to encourage? Ethics are often embedded in laws. And that's true. That's true in little ways and big ways. We have certain things like, if you start learning tractate broached from the beginning, and you get to the question of, can a worker say the Shema if they're at the top of a tree? They've been hired out to harvest from someone else's tree, and it's going to take a few minutes to come down from the tree, gather their concentration, go back up to the tree. And the Mishnah says, no, it's fine. Just do it on top of the tree. You're on someone else's clock, right? That's a profound value of the employer-employee relationship. It says, if someone's paying you for your time needs to be taken very seriously in a way that's different from if you're on your own time, right? There's different kinds of values that go in here that come to make a law. Now, we're going to be looking at Tractate Bava Batra, which the title means nothing useful at all. It literally just means last part or last gate. But the beginning deals with laws of neighbors. And that's what we're going to be looking at. So I'm going to introduce it a little bit with some of the Mishnah, and then we're going to jump into the Talmud itself. So give me a second, and let me put up the text. Sorry. Here we go. Okay. Here's our, not text. Here's our text. So the Mishnah, the beginning of Bava Batra, begins with questions about partnerships, and actually questions about how partnerships can be dissolved. So what if we shared a courtyard and now we want to divide it? What are the obligations that I have to you that you have to me? I'm not going to read through all of the text here, but it starts shutafin sheratzu la'asot mechitza b'chatzer. Partners who want to make a divider in the courtyard. Can I force you to make a nice one? Can we suffice with a minimal one? And then the Mishnah turns to, well, what about responsibilities of neighbors who are not partners? What if my house or my land surrounds your land? And we say, well, if I build a fence, you're going to benefit from that fence. Can I force you to take part in that? And of course, we know, as I think Rabbi Andelman said at the beginning, this is a broad question that takes place all the time. But what are your responsibilities to your neighbors? On the one hand, in America, we have this private ownership very deeply rooted in our culture. At the same time, it's obvious that anything I do on my property might affect my neighbors, which is why we have zoning laws, right? I can't, for example, rent out my basement as a apartment unto itself. The Mishnah has zoning laws as well. Can I open a tannery shop in my basement? Well, since it smells really strongly and really badly, probably not, right? Even though it's my shop, it's going to be affecting the neighbors. When we first moved into our house, going back more than a decade, you probably can all sympathize with this. So we bought a house. We had no money left. So we were like, okay, we'll get to dealing with the grass at some point. I don't know. I don't know about a lawnmower. I can't hire someone right now. And our neighbor, very fine person, said, what you do with your lawn affects the way the whole neighborhood looks. That's something that actually you need to prioritize, because it's not just for you. It's actually what everyone else sees as well. I thought that was a really profound point, because it's easy to think well, it's my lawn, leave me alone. But actually, it does shape what the neighborhood looks like. So the Mishnah also, responsibilities of neighbors. What does it mean if to live next to someone? What if our wall fell down and we need to compel the other person to contribute to building it up? This is actually relevant to what we'll talk about, but I'm going to gloss over it for right now. And then the Mishnah that we actually will talk more about is this one. So let's look at this one in a little bit more detail. So the Mishnah says, Kofinoto livnot beit sha'ar v'delet lachatzer. They, unstated they, can compel a resident to build a gatehouse and a door for a courtyard. So we all live around the courtyard, and the Residents Association is collecting for the gatehouse or for the new door to the courtyard. And one person says, nah, I don't like doors. Now, unfortunately, it's not only up to you. Right? This is a residents association, and you must contribute. So we can force a resident to pay. Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel objects. He says, why? In fact, not all courtyards are fit for a gatehouse. And not everyone needs to have a gatehouse on their courtyard. So what if this person is right? They hold out and they say, I don't want a courtyard. I don't want a door on my courtyard. And the truth is, there's no reason for them to have a door on the courtyard. Just because 80% of the people in the courtyard decided they need to have a door doesn't mean that there's some reason they need to have a door. Why can't he hold out and object on the grounds that there's no need for a door? So he has an objection. Next case. Kofinato livnot la'ir choma udlatayin uvriach. They can compel a resident to contribute to building a wall for the town, and not just a wall, but those double doors and a bolt. Right? So a town needs security. So who's going to pay for the wall? We compel each person to contribute. And again, Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel says, I don't know, I need more information. Not every town needs a wall. Why do you need a wall? We need to at least ask some more questions. The Mishnah says, again, moving on. Who's a resident? Kama yehe ba'ir v'yehe kanshei ha'ir. What if you come to me and you say, look, you have to contribute, everyone's paying $100 to build a wall. And I say, I don't live here. He said, what do you mean? You don't live here? No. I just moved here 2 months ago. I'm renting this place. I don't know how long I'm going to last. I'm not a resident. How long do you have to be here to be a resident? The Mishnah says, 12 months. But if they purchase the house, then immediately, right? So renting, you got a break. You have 12 months until you're considered a resident. But if you've purchased the house, then immediately you become considered a resident. The Mishnah then comes back to the rules of partnerships, and we're not going to read this right now, but talks about what the rules are, what the criteria are for when I may or may not be allowed to dissolve a partnership. Maybe I can't dissolve a partnership if the courtyard is not big enough, or if the field is not big enough. So all sorts of questions that we won't worry about right now. And that's the end of the first chapter of Bava Batra. So overall, there's clearly a theme here, right? It is the theme of what does one person owe to the other people that they live next to or together in proximity with? Not my own property, but what do I owe to you for the sake of your property? Just by virtue of the fact that we live near each other. So let's go back to that Mishnah that I said we're going to focus on. So it's this Mishnah, that we compel a resident to build a gatehouse or a door for the courtyard. Now, I started off by saying that every law encodes values, right? We make laws because we have certain values. So this Mishnah seems to rely on a particular value. And that value is, at a first level, that gatehouses and doors to courtyards are good things. If everyone's voted to make a gatehouse and someone's holding out, we can compel them because they're fundamentally good. It's a positive thing to have a gatehouse and a door. Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel says, I don't know, is it always? It doesn't seem to be always a good thing. But the first opinion, the dominant view, says, no, if people want a gatehouse, we need to build a gatehouse. But that's a value choice. And the Talmud immediately says, I don't know if I agree with that. So the Mishnah seems to be encoding a value. Is this to say that a gatehouse is a good thing? Lememra de Beit Sha'ar ma'al yutahi? And the Talmud says, as a law, I didn't have much to say about it. But as a value, I do have something to say about it. Because I'm not sure that gatehouses are good things. And my evidence that gatehouses are not necessarily good things comes from a story. Talmud says, I heard a story once that seems to argue the opposite. Veha, hahu chasidah, to have a mishta'e Eliyahu hadeh. What about that pious man, the chassid? There was a pious man. Remember the story about the pious man? Of course. That pious man whom Eliyahu, Elijah the prophet, used to visit and talk to all the time. Remember the story of that man? But when he made a gatehouse for his home, Elijah no longer visited him. So he had this sort of working relationship with Elijah. Elijah would come visit this pious man all the time. But he stopped when the man made a security system. When he put in a security system, Elijah stopped showing up. Why? Well, because this story says, but there's a different value, right? Security, I get it, that's a good value. But openness is a good value also. Like, people should be able to walk into your home, not dangerous people, right? But other people who want to visit you perhaps, maybe dead prophets like Elijah, but also more importantly, as all the commentators point out, poor people. Poor people need to be able to knock on your door. You need to be able to open the door and see a poor person who says, look, I'm really, really in tough straits right now. And you need to be able to look them in the eye and decide whether you're going to help them. Hopefully, yes. But if they can't even get to your door, you don't even have that encounter. And so openness, accessibility is also a value. And therefore, the Talmud says, I'm not sure that a gatehouse is a good thing. Because what does a gatehouse do? A gatehouse means that, 100 meters before you ever get to my door, you can't get there because there's a gatehouse. You don't get in to knock on my door. And so the Mishnah had assumed that a gatehouse is a good thing because of the added security, and therefore we can compel people to contribute to that cause. But the Talmud says, I get that security is a good thing, but it comes at a cost. And I'm not sure how to balance these values here. Security is important, but it has to be counterbalanced with the value of openness. And this story, so it's always an interesting question, what roles stories are playing in the Talmud. Talmud, everyone says it's fundamentally a book of law, but then you're like, but here are a bunch of stories from the Talmud. What roles are those stories playing? In this case, the story plays a very interesting role. The story plays the role of showing us the opposite value that we saw in the Mishnah. The Mishnah said, closing off is inherently a positive thing, and therefore we can compel people to contribute to that cause. The story says, actually, closing off is inherently a bad thing because it prohibits access. It doesn't let people get in. So much so that this man, this Chassid, whom Eliyahu used to visit, stopped getting visits from Eliyahu. Now the Talmud, as is its wont, answers this question. Says, well, it's not that there are two values and we don't know what to do with them. There are two values, that's true, but we can balance them. La kasha, it's not a problem. It depends where the gatehouse is and how it works. So if you can walk into the courtyard before you get to the gatehouse, okay, added security is not a bad thing. But if the gatehouse is outside, preventing someone from even getting into the courtyard at all, that indeed comes at too great a cost. Too great a cost. So the Talmud's point here seems to be that whereas the Mishnah privileged the value of security and mutual responsibility to contribute to that security, that has to be balanced with the value of accessibility, of openness, and you need to do security in a way that preserves accessibility and openness. So I think it's quite interesting, right? The way the Talmud does this discussion. Now, the Talmud that goes along, I'm sorry that the English font's a bit too small here. Just very briefly, I'll sort of wrap up this one point and then pause for comments or questions. The Talmud says, well, let's go back to that debate in the Mishnah that the first voice said, you could always compel someone to contribute to the gatehouse or to the city walls. And Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel said, not every courtyard needs a gatehouse. Not every city needs a wall. So the Talmud says, no, that makes a lot of sense, actually. Right? It really depends on security is a legitimate concern if you have security problems. If you're near the big street, if you're near the main thoroughfare, I get it. You're concerned about just like strangers sort of coming off and invading your courtyard. But if you're a courtyard in a quiet part of town, deep within the city, that's far away from the highway, what are you so worried about? And in that case, the Talmud says, Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel seems to make a lot of sense. Not every courtyard needs a gatehouse. Why do the rabbis not make that distinction also? And Talmud says, well, the rabbis say, but there are times that the public is pressed in and enters even far from the main thoroughfares. Like even quiet neighborhoods sometimes get overrun. Which is interesting because they're essentially conceding the point, right? They're essentially saying, look, it's a fair question. If there's never going to be a time that anyone's going to invade your courtyard, if you never have like masses of people outside your courtyard, you don't need a gatehouse in your courtyard, right? At that point, any cost of openness is just too much. There's no benefit here. But if you're in a place where crowds might come in, or even in a far-fetched way, crowds might show up one day, then there's a need for security. We need to balance it. And they're going to say the same thing about the town with its walls and double doors. Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel says, not every town needs walls. Like, why does every town need walls? The rabbis say, but it depends, right? And this is going to sound, unfortunately, a bit too realistic. There are times that it happens that an enemy army comes. Right? Every town might need walls. I don't know how to predict when it might be, but at some point there might be a need for walls in every town. The Zimnin de Mikrev Ate Gaisa, an army might show up at any time. So they concede the point, right? If there's no value of security at all, there's really no reason to build a wall. There's certainly no reason to compel people to contribute to that. But they have a much more expansive view of what it means that there might be a time that it's necessary. And they say, look, it might be that people will come. It might be that enemies will come. And that is a legitimate concern in and of itself. Okay, I want to pause here. We're going to move to two other issues that the Talmud then raises, but let me pause for a moment and see if there's any comments or questions that people have up to this point.
Thank you. Okay, there was a question about the anonymous they that you referred to, who compelled this person to do this or that in a given situation. So someone asked about, about that. Are we imagining kind of a Jewishly self-governing community? Does any of this change if we're, in a minority culture with a larger ruling power?
That's a great question. And that's exactly right. So this is assuming basically, well, the Jewish part is almost secondary. It's more of a small self-governing town that has a cohesive social civic body and function. It's sort of obvious that we is a we. This makes little sense. It's very hard to map this directly onto any of the lifestyles that we have today, except for like a small yishuv in Israel, where you can sort of still see the same, where there's a sense of, first of all, it's small enough to actually, like just pragmatically, actually work this way, and a sense of cohesiveness that we're all in this together. We've chosen to be here. We have a responsibility towards each other. But it's true, how to actually apply this in sort of real life for most of us today is a challenging question. It's actually one of the reasons that I want to talk about the values here rather than the pragmatic law. The law is interesting, but the law is clearly inapplicable to most of us most of the time. Whereas the values are actually really interesting. I'm not going to say that if the Talmud says this is the value, then we have to just sit back and say, okay, I just learned what the Talmud says, this is now my value. But I do think it's really important and worthwhile to have the Talmud as a thought partner in thinking about our values. Because the Talmud's thinking this through also, and it's thinking it through in a context that's different than ours, in a way that's different than ours, in a language that's different than ours. And that's useful. If we think like, oh, it's obvious to us what our values are, bring it to the Talmud and let's have this conversation and let's see where we emerge in the end. It may be that I override what the Talmud says. I say, you know what, that made sense 1800 years ago. It's not going to work for me today. Or maybe, we'll see in a second, that there are value judgments that I just don't share. But it may be that being challenged by the values of the Talmud is very worthwhile for us. We're like, oh, that's interesting. I hadn't thought about it that way. So it's not so much the practical law that I want to focus on as much as the values animating the discussions.
I really appreciate that framing, and I think, not to be too abstract, but I went to a class recently where someone was comparing American law with halacha in a given area, and he was looking at the exact same area. He was looking at the death penalty, and it wasn't the right comparison, in my opinion, because right in the Talmud, the death penalty, like the rabbis have already set things up so that we're not executing we're not executing the death penalty. We're not using it. We're not applying it. And there are other texts about the value of life, right? Like, so it's, I think your point is very well taken, that we sometimes need to or generally, really, we should be looking deeper at what is this text actually about to know where it applies in our lives. All right, enough of me. I want to take another question. So, and this maybe is a little more related to what you're saying. So this person was asking about the example of the Hasid, the story with Eliyahu, and is it about the idea of using sort of an exceptional person as a paradigm? Sort of how much can we learn from that versus a regular person?
That's a really great question. That's a very good. It's a great thing to focus on, to ask that question. So the Talmud seems to be assuming not so much that obviously Elijah is not coming to my house ever. So that part is sort of granted. It's not saying that Elijah will show up if I don't have a gatehouse. But when he made a gatehouse, Elijah stopped coming. And the assumption seems to be that he's not being held to a higher standard than anyone else. Gatehouses are not good in and of themselves. He had no need for one. And so as soon as he put one up, he barred accessibility. Now, Elijah presumably doesn't have to worry about gatehouses. So it's not that he couldn't get in, but he wouldn't go to a house that has set up an overly onerous way of getting to the door. That's not the kind of house that Elijah visits. Elijah visits houses that are accessible to other people. Now, you're right. You could have said, like, well, maybe he's holding the pious man to a higher standard. That's an interesting point. All I could say is that the Talmud doesn't seem to think so. So the Talmud deploys the story in a way that takes for granted that this is the same value that we all have. But again, it's a balanced value, right? It's one value among other values. That's what I think is very interesting about this. That doesn't say gatehouses are bad, the Mishnah needs to be overruled. It says gatehouses come at a cost, and so we need to think about how to balance that cost with the benefits.
Right. There are a lot of folks commenting on gated communities today, and I think it's a great example of costs and benefits that come with those kinds of structures. Do you want to take one more question, or do you want to move on?
Short question, I think is fine. And then we can move on. Yeah.
You know what? Let's move on, because I know you have a lot of material. We'll come back to it if there's time.
All right, sounds good. Okay, so let's in fact move on then. Okay, so this is actually interesting, because the Talmud then asks, well, hold on. We have a town. We're building a wall. 10 minutes ago, I said we're collecting $100 from each person. But that's a crazy system. No one seriously does that, right? We're not going to collect the same amount from every person. We know that there's going to be a hierarchy of giving, but what should the hierarchy of giving be? This is, of course, a question of values that's all the time in our discourse. So Rabbi Elazar asked Rabbi Yochanan, when they collect, do they collect according to net worth or according to the number of people? So the point seems to be, do you pay by how much you can pay, or do you pay by how much you're benefiting? So if I chose to have 18 people in my household, even if I'm poor, I'm benefiting. 18 people are benefiting from this added security. Whereas you, very wealthy, but only have 3 people in your household, so you're getting 1/6 the benefit that I'm getting. So do we pay based on our ability to pay, or based on how much benefit we're getting? He said to him, as Rabbi Yochanan answered, they collect according to the net worth. And Elazar, my son, nail this down. Kvaba masmerot. So unambiguous. Now, if this is not your first time ever reading anything in the Talmud, you're going to be shocked, right? Because the Talmud never nails anything down. Like, it's always an open-ended question. The Talmud is terrible at actually answering questions. It usually answers a question and then says, wait a second, no, I could think about it differently, right? Like, you have a proof? No, I mean, that proof's not a good proof. And this is so unambiguous, it's actually pretty shocking. Rabbi Yochanan says, we collect according to people's ability to pay, how wealthy they are. But lest you think that was the end of the story, there are people who tell the story in the opposite way. There are those who say, Rabbi Elazar asked Rabbi Yochanan, when they collect, do they collect according to the net worth or according to proximity of houses? In other words, how close is your house to the wall? Again, imagine a circular town with a wall around it. If you're near the wall, if there is an invading army, the closer you are to the wall, the more danger you're in. So do I pay by where I am, and therefore how much benefit I'm getting from this wall? Or do I pay by how much money I have, and therefore how much I can give to it? And here, in this version of the story, Rabbi Yochanan answers exactly the opposite. They collect according to the proximity of houses. And Elazar, my son, nail this down. So the Talmud is consistent, at least, in not ever answering a question. Here they do answer the question, but they answer it. They say there's two versions of the answer, and they're exactly the opposite. So that's this question, which again I think animates many of our conversations of how does one adjudicate responsibility among a community? How much do I owe? Is it based on my benefit? How much do I can? Just because I have, does that mean I have to give more? It's not obvious, right? That articulates a certain value. It articulates a value of ability equals responsibility, whereas one might argue a different value. If I'm benefiting more, that's my responsibility. Again, this is we sometimes take these things for granted, but they're not at all to be taken for granted. And I think that's what the Talmud is sort of laying bare here, is that if we're going to pretend that we're designing a society from scratch, right? I like Rabbi Andelman's point a minute ago about the death penalty, right? So since they didn't actually carry out the death penalty, they're free to imagine it as they see fit. Like, what ought it be? So the rabbis here also, like, are they actually in charge of taxation? So we'll see a couple of stories where they certainly are involved, but here they're dealing with the theory, right? How should we design an ideal society? How should tax systems work? How do you assess one person's responsibility? And the big question for them is it's never going to be the same from everyone, but is it that you get based on how much you have to give? So your ability to contribute means responsibility, or is it your benefit means responsibility? I think that's a question absolutely worth thinking more about. Okay, let's go on a bit. So now we get the longest story that we're going to read. I want to read it fairly quickly. It's only 2 slides. Read it fairly quickly and try to unpack a little bit of what's going on. So the Talmud, this is still the same page, literally the same page of the Talmud, and they're continuing to talk about communal responsibility. Well, what happens? Forget the daily life. We need a wall. Once you build that wall, you need to upkeep the wall, but it's going to be there forever. What about in times of need? So there was a famine. How much do we have to help each other in times of famine? So Rabbi Judah the Prince, Rabbi, opened the storehouses in years of famine. And he said, let all those who have studied scripture, Mishnah, or Talmud enter. So he's being very generous with anyone who has studied Torah. But do not let the people of the land enter. And Am Haaretz, ignoramus, they can't come. A certain rabbi, Rabbi Jonathan ben Amram, pushed forward and entered. And he said, Rabbi, my rabbi, support me. Rabbi Judah said to him, have you studied scripture? Now we know, we're reading the story. We know that he has. He's Rabbi Jonathan ben Amram. He's studied scripture. Have you studied scripture? No. Have you studied Mishnah? No. Have you served rabbinic sages? No. Now again, all this is not true, right? He's underselling himself. He's done all of those, but he won't admit any of it. So Rabbi says to him, so how should I support you? Like, for what? On behalf of what should I support you? You haven't done anything to earn the support. And Rabbi Jonathan says, support me like a dog or a raven. Support me like a dog or a raven. In other words, so, okay, assume I've done nothing at all. A raven's never done anything to you, but you don't let a raven starve to death either. You give it some crumbs, you give it some corn, you give it something. So pretend I'm a dog or a raven. Just take care of me. Parnaseh, and he did. So at this point, it seems like a great story, right? Like Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi, Rabbi Judah the Prince, thinks that he should only be supporting Torah scholars. Along comes this Rabbi Jonathan ben Amram, and by pretending to be, he goes incognito, by pretending to be someone who's never learned anything, he convinces Rabbi Judah to support him, even though he's not has not earned it. So you think like, oh, Rabbi Judah's really learned an important lesson here. But not so fast. After Rabbi Jonathan leaves, Rabbi Judah the Prince sat down and lamented. He was very upset at himself. He said, I can't believe that. I can't believe I did that. I'm upset at myself for being so merciful. woe to me that I gave my bread to Am Haaretz, to an ignoramus. I can't believe I actually was tricked into supporting an ignoramus. Rabbi Shimon, his son, the son of Rabbi Yehuda, says to him, I don't think that was actually a regular person. I think that was Jonathan ben Amram. I recognize him. Like, we know that guy. He's learned Torah before. He's been in the academy before. He's been in the Beit Midrash. I think it was him. He just doesn't want to benefit from the honor of Torah. They investigated and found that this was correct. So when I first read the story, I was like, oh man, I was excited that there was like a learning moment here for Rabbi Judah, that he thought he was only going to sustain Talmudic rabbinic sages, but he learned he was going to sustain other people and that would be a good thing. But as it turns out, he actually learned that he did sustain a rabbinic sage and he's happy because of that. So he never really learned the lesson of sustaining other people, taking care of other people outside of his circles. Despite that, I think there's a couple of interesting things here. One is that it seems to have been enough for him to put a name to the person. Right? So now that he knows it's Jonathan ben Amram, that already makes him feel better. So he doesn't call him Rabbi Jonathan ben Amram here. He just says Jonathan. I think that was Jonathan ben Amram. So maybe that's already something, just putting a name on it might be actually significant. Like when you support someone, and I don't know nothing about this person, like literally nothing. You know, a person shows up or they're on the street and they say, I need money. I don't know you. I don't know anything about you. I don't know your background. I don't know your story. It's tough. And in fact, it's so tough that we often find ourselves making up excuses for why I'm not going to support them, right? They're probably going to abuse the money. They didn't do this. They could have done that. So I'm going to come up with all sorts of excuses why I'm not going to give them money. It's pretty clear that they need money. They're on the street. But I'm going to come up with a reason. And the fundamental issue is that I don't know this person at all. Right? There's nothing about them that's accessible to me. Whereas if I get to know them a little bit, suddenly it's a whole different ballgame. A whole different ballgame. There's lots of texts that are relevant to that point, both rabbinic texts and other texts. But one rabbinic text, really amazing midrash in Vayikra Rabbah, talking about tzedakah. And I want to come back to tzedakah in a second. But talking about tzedakah, the midrash says, listen carefully to what the poor people on the street say. They say in Aramaic, in the Aramaic of the land of Israel, they say, Zechibi, Zechibi. Zechibi means literally give me charity, even though that's a word I want to talk about in a second. But if you listen carefully, it sounds like Sichibi, Zechibi, Sichibi. And Sichibi means look at me. And the Midrash says what the poor person is really saying is not so much give me money, but just look at me. Look at who I am. Look at where I've come from. Look at where I am now. Look at where I want to get to again. Just look at me. And that is a profound moment in the act of helping someone, of sustaining someone. And I think it might be true in our story as well. Once Rabbi Yehuda knows that that's Jonathan, it's not just a guy who came in and said, I'm like a dog or a raven. It's Jonathan. Oh, Jonathan. Okay. Jonathan, I can take care of. This is actually, there's something deep here, like really profound about the way we act, but it's also actually a profound point about a question about the way we ought to act. So there's some very influential philosophers whom I like a lot. The most famous is Peter Singer, who essentially thinks that it doesn't matter if you know who the person is. Right? I'm not going to say much about Singer's philosophy now, but it's probably familiar to most of you. Thinks, if you would not let someone drown right in front of you or starve to death right in front of you, then you shouldn't let someone starve to death 6,000 miles away either. The fact that they're anonymous makes no ethical difference to the obligation to sustain them. That's sort of the core of Singer's ideas about giving. Once you say that, a lot of things follow. But it's actually not all that obvious that that's true. It's at least arguable that we have appropriately circles of responsibility, and people that I know, people that are closest to me, take priority over people who are farther. And I don't just mean take priority, mean I do them first, but that I have a higher level of obligation. And that conceivably someone at a far enough distance from me, I'm actually not that obligated to them. It's a challenge. I think it's a challenging question to wonder about. Singer takes for granted that it doesn't matter where a person is or how distant they are from me. our obligation toward each person is the same. My family is not more significant than a stranger in Southeastern Asia. The rabbinic law overall certainly comes from a different perspective. It says that actually the poor of your town take precedence. And the poor of a different town, well, you got to ask why they're not being taken care of there. Again, applying this to our world is massively complicated, but the idea that there is a difference, that there's a hierarchy of responsibility as someone gets farther and farther away from me, seems to be what our story is about. Rabbi said, look, this is for my people. This is for the rabbinic sages. I'm not supporting everyone. Someone else has to support everyone. But once you put a name on someone, that expands our circles. So there's interesting tension here in terms of responsibility and obligation and how far that goes. Now, I'm actually not going to pause here. Let me continue with just a couple last lines, and then I'll say some last things and open it up for discussion. Now, if you notice, we've sort of shaded in the last slide, right on the same page of the Talmud, we've shaded from building a wall to taking care of poor people. Now, we're taking care of poor people in the time of famine, but the Talmud now makes a big jump and says, actually, this is true in general. Collecting from people to build a wall is the same responsibility and same mechanisms even as the collections that we undertake to support poor people. This too is a civic responsibility that we all need to contribute to. I'm not going to read this part right now, but here, the Talmud then says there's two major organs, two major institutions of charity. Now, I should say, I kept saying I don't like the word charity here. Well, I said that I should say something about the word charity. The charity comes from Latin, caritas, piety, right? Something above and beyond what you need to do, right? The question earlier about the chassid being pious, being like, that's not normal. That's a really great point about charity. Tzedakah means justice, right? This is a different conceptualization of the money that I need to give to the person who needs food. Is that caritas? Is that kindness? Is that above and beyond? It's my money, but hey, I'll share it with you. Or is it tzedakah? This is basic justice. Like there's a poor person, I have enough to eat, you need money, I give it to you. So the word actually does matter. I won't say more about that now, but it's certainly something to think about, how the word encodes a value already. The Talmud says there are two institutions of tzedakah. There's a kupah and a tamchui. Kupah and a tamchui. Now, literally, these are both actually vessels, different kinds of bowls. But as they describe it, the kupah was something like a food pantry. So collect from people for the kupah, and then every Friday, the townspeople who need it can come to the kupah, and they get food. And they get food for the entire week, 14 meals worth of food. A tamchui is like a soup kitchen. You can show up tonight, you get dinner. And the text says, you don't really check people. If they show up for the tamchui, they show up for dinner, we don't ask a lot of questions. You come, you say you need dinner, we give you dinner. You come, you say you need 14 meals worth of food from our pantry, we're going to have to ask a little bit more about you. We're going to have to ask you to fill out some forms, give us a little bit of background information, some references. That's a much more serious investment on our part, and therefore we're going to take this more seriously when we find out who you are. But both of these, and this is a key point, both of these are responsibilities of the town to upkeep. So I'm just going to skip to the last line here. The townspeople can take the resources of the kupah for the tamchui, or the tamchui for the kupah, and can redirect it for anything they would like. So in other words, if I said to the gabai tzedakah, right, to the people gathering, the gabai, ligbot, they gather. If I say to the gabai, I say, I want to donate $1,000 to the kupah, the gabai can say, fantastic, thank you very much. And then turn around and say, you know what, we really don't need $1,000. The kupah is really well funded. Remember that couple last year, they endowed it, they have like millions of dollars, there's a bronze plaque. The kupah doesn't need money. The tamchui, on the other hand, tamchui like doesn't have enough to feed people on a night-to-night basis. The townspeople can redirect the funds from kupah to tamchui, tamchui to kippah, or anything else they would like. Right? You see that? L'shanota l'chol mashe yirtzu. What do you mean for anything they may like? So this is actually debated. What are the parameters of that? That's debated among some of the medieval commentators. Some of them say, well, look, that's limited. Only things for the sake of the poor people. Some of them say, no. This is not fundamentally about poor people. It's fundamentally about a town taking care of its needs. It has poor people, that's a need. It has security needs. It has paving the roads needs. It has general upkeep needs. There's all sorts of things that a town needs to do. And if I come and I say, here's $1,000 for the poor people, and you're like, poor people actually were really well funded, but Main Street needs a new stop sign, then the townspeople, according to this view, can actually redirect my money to the stop sign, because this view sees taking care of the poor as another communal responsibility on the same level as upkeep of a town. Now, this might sound like overly bureaucratizing, right? Like poor people, we should take them as human beings, not as like paving the streets. But it's actually a very bureaucratically progressive way of thinking about poor. The Talmud really moves away from the idea that that tzedakah should fundamentally be an individual poor person finding someone who happens to have a few dollars in their pockets that they can survive today. Talmud doesn't like that system. They want there to be systems in place, the kupan and tamchui, said if you're poor, you never have to worry. You don't have to beg door to door. You go to the kupa. They'll give you 14 meals worth. If you're in a town that's not yours, no problem, go to the tamchui. They'll give you dinner tonight. They'll make sure that you can survive today till you get back home. This is the bureaucracy, like a lot of instances of bureaucracy. Like bureaucracy is fundamentally there. Like I'm not defending all of bureaucracy, but the reason it exists often is actually to try to make things better, right? Not to make things obstacles for people, but because it's actually really degrading and embarrassing for someone to have to go door to door hoping that they can collect $12 today so that they can fund enough food for them for tonight. Much better to have a bureaucratized system where I can go to the tamchui or go to the kupa. In sum, let me sort of wrap this up because I want to make sure to leave enough time for questions here and comments as well. The Talmud, the whole sugya, the whole discussion here, and I've just skipped around from from topic to topic, but the basic problem struggles with the problem of the diffusion of responsibility, right? Which we know of all the time, right? If I send an email to 3 people, no one's going to answer, right? Because each one is going to assume that the other 2 will answer. But if I send an email to 1 person, they'll answer. So we have this in civic life all the time. We all know that we need to pave the roads and that we need to build a wall and then we need to take care of the poor people. But is that my responsibility? Like, why should it be my responsibility? There's a lot of other people in town, so why should I do it if no one else is doing it? And of course, what that means is that no one will do it. And that's the problem with the diffusion of responsibility. If you actually diffuse responsibility, that's fine if everyone does it. But what actually ends up happening is that no one does it, and then we have a real problem. So how do we apportion responsibility so that we can make sure that the things that we all need to do are in fact taken care of? That's the major topic of our sugya. In thinking about that, the Talmud explores all sorts of value questions, sort of fundamental values. So what does it mean to live life in a civil society where we have mutual responsibilities? So we started with the question of openness versus security, right? Those come at, that's a zero-sum game, more or less, right? If you're very open, you're not gonna have security. Now, our country, the United States, has this problem, like this is, right now, we have other things to worry about. But for the last decade or more, has been struggling with this, rarely put into terms of fundamental values because of our political system, but that's basically what we had, right? We all agree that there's a value of security. We all agree that there's a value of openness. The question is how to balance them. I don't have a simple answer for that in any given circumstance, but that's the same question that the Talmud is discussing here. We need to have openness, we need to have security, we need to figure out how to balance those two. So there's ways that are sensitive to both, right? Maybe we get security without locking people out. Maybe we have openness, but still allowing some access. We're still still putting up some sort of security. But that value conflict is certainly something that's a legitimate conflict and that we struggle with on a daily basis. Another value, how do we apportion responsibility on the financial level, right? So if we're all going to contribute, it doesn't seem fair to me, who lives alone, that I should have to pay the same as my neighbor who has 18 children. What did I say? They had 18 people, 16 children. Maybe it's 14 children and their parents are there, whatever. Like, I don't benefit nearly as much from the freshly paved road in front of my house as my neighbor does. They have 6 cars coming in and out all the time. I drive once a week. So why should I pay as much? Well, that's a legitimate point. On the other hand, I'm sitting on a lot more money. So maybe you take from me what I can give, whereas they don't have so much money. Again, real deep value question, how to apportion that responsibility. And then, really fascinatingly, the question of including taking care of the poor as a civil responsibility. Just the conceptualization of tzedakah as belonging to this sugya is an amazingly profound point, right? It shouldn't be up to the poor person to find the right person who happens to have money in their pocket and an open heart right now in order to live today. It's our mutual responsibility to take care of everyone in town and make sure that we can go to bed knowing that no one had to go to bed hungry. There's a tamchui. They could have gone to the tamchui. I don't know if everyone did, but I know they could have. It's funded. We figured out how to collect for it. There's enough money there. Make sure it works. In fact, the Rambam, Maimonides, in his code of law, when he talks about the kupan and tamchui, he says, there is some variation among Jewish societies here. I've been to places where there is no kupa, no food pantry, no long-term care for poor people. But there isn't a Jewish community in the world that doesn't have a tamchui. Every Jewish community has a place where you show up, you need a meal, there's a place to go. Now, I think that's not true anymore. But if it's not true anymore, that's a blotch on our societies, because this is deeply embedded in our codes of law and reflecting our values. The idea that no one has to go to bed hungry, there is a place to go, that's something that the Talmud takes for granted. And again, the idea of how to conceptualize taking care of the poor as a communal need is a major statement of values that the Talmud does. So I want to sum this up very quickly. This is what the Talmud does in a language and style very different from our own, but in a way that I think can enrich and deepen our own thinking about topics of relevance. You need to find the right sugya that engages the topic that you want to talk about. But the Talmud engages with value questions in a way that really can help us think through our own, even if we wind up disagreeing, as a thought partner. Like, that's one way of handling it. I might not go the same way. Maybe life was different, but that's something that it's worth confronting ourselves with as a way of enriching our own thought. Okay, I'll end with that. And please, Rabbi Andelman, if there's comments or questions of yours or others.
All right, that was a massive amount of material that, as you were alluding to as you went through, raises like a million parallels with modern life, like the federation system, collecting centrally. I mean, just like on and on and on, and what you just raised. I just want to highlight the point that you made at the end there, about the placement of this little tzedakah, the kupa / tamchui discussion in this sugya that seems generally to be about fairness, a sort of an assumption about like fairness and equal benefit in society, which in any given legal question, you could come down on different sides in terms of how, like, what do we think is the most fair? But the sugya seems to assume like that's what we're going for, right? It's a principle of social equality in some way, and what you said, that we're placing the idea of providing for the less fortunate there, not somewhere else, but just part of kind of the bedrock of our social values is making sure that no one's left out of it. So
Maybe I can just comment on that very
Yeah,
briefly, because I
please.
think fair is such an interesting question, right? Because who wants to be against fairness? Like fairness seems like a good thing, but fair is one value among others, right? So it might be that something is fair, but therefore unjust, or fair, but therefore doesn't accomplish what we want it to accomplish. I mean, fairness is not the be all and end all of our values. If we demand for, like, clearly a progressive tax rate, like we have, like some people think it's not progressive enough, but we have a progressive tax rate, right? Wealthy people don't just pay this more money, but they pay a higher tax rate. That's obviously unfair, right? It's by definition not fair. It might be important for other reasons. We say it's just. We say that responsibility, with opportunity comes responsibility, with success comes responsibility. If someone said, but it's not fair, I don't think you could say it is fair. Say it's not fair, but fairness is one value among others, and we've decided that it's not the most important one here.
Right. So I think maybe it's a semantic issue, because I was thinking it is fair. It's not equal, but it's fair, right? So I think we're saying the same thing using different terms.
Maybe. Well, in that case, I have to tell you a quick story of Professor Sidney Morgenbesser, Zichrono Livracha, who was a professor of philosophy at Columbia. And he had legendarily, some of you might be his students, so I don't, if you know better stories about him, feel free to let us know in the chat. But in the 60s, he was in a anti-war protest in Columbia, where the police came in and started hitting people with batons. And one of his students said, Professor Morgenbesser, they're beating us. It's not just, it's not fair. And he said, well, it's not just, but it's absolutely fair because they're beating all of us at the same rate.
All right. I wanted to just ask a clarifying question about the text with Rebbe and his son and the storehouses and Rabbi Yonatan ben Amram. Because it seemed to me that text sort of stood apart, that passage, that section of the text kind of stood apart from the others, in that it struck me as being very comfortable with the idea of there being privileged groups within society, and a comfort with either wealth disparity or at least disparity in how different people are treated. So, and you mentioned at the end of when you were going through that, I think you were unpacking it as kind of being about like your circle and the circles going out. And I just wanted to understand that better, because, right, I think, is it not talking about sort of the storehouses available to the whole community, but Rebbe is only making them available to some people? It's not like there are some other storehouses available for the Amei Haaretz, for the less educated. So is it not a text about privilege?
I think it is a text about privilege. It's depending, I guess, on what exactly we mean by privilege. But yeah, it's so unfortunately we don't have more context, right? We don't get a sort of social history of who's taking care of whom and how everyone else is getting fed. Unfortunately, that would certainly help us. It's not clear. So Rabbi Yehuda Nasi is massively wealthy. I mean, that we get from other stories. The line in Bava Metzia is that his shepherd is richer than the Persian king or something. He's so wealthy that he can afford anything. So it's possible these are his own private storehouses. It's also possible that they're communal. If they're communal, then what you're saying is obviously very troubling, right? Like communal storehouses only for rabbis, that seems like a fairly serious moral issue. If they're private, now my intuition is I intimated this. My intuition is to still recoil from this, right? I mean, still, you have so much money and you're choosing to only use it on people that are like you, that you favor. That still seems inappropriate. And I don't know what the bottom line right answer should be here, but that's where I do think that there is a question of circles. Is it really morally abhorrent to take care of people in my circles more than people not in my circles? So of course, to some extent, it depends on exactly what you said earlier. I mean, like, well, is someone else taking care of them? Because if no one's taking care of them, then that changes everything, right? Then of course, it seems to throw open the gates of our circles, and you can't let someone starve to death because they're not in my circle. But if there are just overlapping circles, right? There's lots of wealthy people. can I make my cause supporting the people who are like me? No, I mean, we seem to intuitively recoil from that and yet do it all the time, right? I think that's, so that's a fair dilemma. I mean, what's the right answer? I don't know. It's hard to articulate why we think it's okay, but we do seem to think it's okay that we take care of our own. And we clearly buy things for our children where we know that we could have used that money to buy, like, literally someone, someone who's starving to death. I could have supported them for a day. Like, those terrible commercials, terrible in a good way, but terrible to tell me, like, for 50 cents a day, I can keep a kid alive. And I chose not to, and instead spend $30 on a Lego set. Like, that's crazy. Did I literally just say that instead of supporting someone for 60 days, I bought a Lego set? No, that sounds crazy on the one hand. On the other hand, it sort of intuitively makes sense, right? I mean, this is my child. So aren't I responsible to them on some higher level? That's not it seems like a terrible thing to say, but it seems like a terrible thing to say only because it comes at the expense of some other value we have, right? The point is that is also a value. And I think it's possible that's what our view is reflecting. Again, that assumes that there's other storehouses. I don't know for a fact, but if not, this is really deeply problematic. So if there are, it's challenging, but not abhorrent for a rich person to say, you know what, I'm going to first of all take care of the people in my circles. If you really don't have money, let me know. But otherwise, this is for the people in my circles. Someone else will deal with other people.
There are a couple of comments about these circles that I thought would add to our discussion here. So I'm going to paraphrase this one comment, but there was a suggestion that you could argue a more pressing obligation to contribute within your own circle, based on the idea that there's sort of an ecosystem that the people in that circle are part of, and that if you are among the more fortunate, then perhaps you've contributed in some way to someone else being less fortunate. Like, right, if there's sort of a semi-closed system, economic system in within that circle. I don't know if you want to comment on that.
I mean, that's a really interesting point. And again, applying this to the real world is going to be tricky. I think the Talmud takes for granted that we're talking about geographic circles. I mean, it literally does say, when it talks about tzedakah, that the poor of your town take precedence over the poor of other towns. So thinking in terms of very pragmatic geography, right? People close to me as opposed to people far from me. And that's a real question for today. Well, what does that mean? Do I have a town? Like, New York City is a big town, right? So it seems kind of silly to say, like, the poor of New York City take precedence over the poor of Houston. Like, on the one hand, that's true, but am I really responsible for the poor of New York City? That's like pretty big responsibility. And also, you look at Jewish giving, for example, that's not the way we actually act, right? Like, what about Jewish causes, let's say in Israel or in Europe or even elsewhere in the United States? Like, is it really against Jewish values to say that causes that are Jewish but are far away take precedence over things that are nearby? So that's an interesting question. Obviously, 1800 years ago, geography was everything, because how would I even know what needs there are 200 miles away from me? Whereas today, maybe it does change everything. Maybe media really affects what it means, aniyei ircha, the poor of your town. But what's your ear? If ear is a social construct rather than a geographical construct, you could certainly argue that the whole category has been reshaped. I think that's certainly a possible way of thinking about this. But I should say that there are even, I don't remember exactly, I think it was the Khatam Sofer, there are responsa that, early modern or 250 years ago, where already, people are tied in to networks much broader than their own town. I think it's Khatam Sofer has a responsum where he says, well, the poor of your town take precedence over the poor of another town if the other town is going to be taken care of by people in their town. If no one's there to take care of them, and it's just a question of, are you going to let them die of starvation because they're not in your town, or should you take care of them? Of course you should take care of them. Obviously, like, basic needs of people even far away come at some early level of priority. Now, putting this all together makes it very complicated, right? Like, because then it brings us back to our starving kids in Southeast Asia or Africa questions. Like, oh, wait, hold on, am I really responsible then before I buy Lego? That's a tough thing to swallow, but maybe it's true. Maybe they're not in our circle. Maybe there's maybe kinship is actually an ethically relevant category. Maybe being related to someone, even if it means, distantly. So there's a lot to play with here. And again, I don't think any of these texts mean to lay down guidance for how you should spend the $100 that you've put aside for end of year giving in 2023 in New York. But as values to consider as you're thinking about, like, well, what are my priorities? I think these are all very valuable, because then you can come down and say, like, well, actually, I'm going to do this. I've thought about this, right? And here's the way that I've come to this conclusion. I've thought about geography as opposed to social circles. I've thought about basic needs as opposed to higher level needs. I've thought about all these things, and what I've decided is whatever I've decided, as long as it's made after thinking that through, then I think the Talmud has done its job. Sort of forces us to think through these things.
So, so maybe we can just follow that a little further. I mean, as you've made clear, and with several examples, it's very difficult to apply, make direct applications of the legal questions to our society today. But just on this geographic question specifically, I mean, there are people have been raising examples in their comments, right? There certainly are local applications. People have raised, for example, how a local school system is funded. Here where I live, in New Jersey, it's all about property taxes, and and that funds the schools. So then property owners are contributing, but non-property owners aren't. So all those complicated situations. But there is still that kind of, there's a local ecosystem at play, or the roads you were talking about. But then obviously there are many things that transcend geography. So my question for you is the geography the salient value here, or should we kind of freely think more broadly about the values to extract from these texts, and kind of just eschew geography in all the situations where it's not relevant?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I think this is a great question to sort of think about out loud, right? I mean, the Talmud talks about geography. How do you apply that? I think that's a question that doesn't come with an answer. I think you actually do have to argue it out, and I can imagine good people disagreeing about it. I can imagine an argument that geography is irrelevant today, which doesn't matter, right? Look, we have all sorts of artificial borders, right? Like my federal taxes help people in San Diego, which is 3,000 something other miles away, but don't help people in Toronto, which is like 500 miles away, right? Because there happens to be a border there, and there's no border there. So we have all sorts of like bizarre realities, but because we've drawn lines in certain ways, therefore we're obligated to certain people and not to other people. So that's a reality of the world. There's no way around that. So I can imagine someone saying, well, this is all, at this point, geography is nonsense. We're sitting on a screen. I mean, we're here learning together. We used to talk about a Beit Midrash. Now we talk about a Zoom school, so a Zoom screen. So like, if we can learn together, I don't know where any of you are. I told you at the beginning that I happen to be in JTS, but we could be anywhere. And, so that already shows you, like, geography is absolutely a meaningless category today. And the same thing should be true for responsibility, right? So just the same way that I can learn with you on the screen, I'm obligated to you based on maybe kinship ties, maybe social networks, values that we have in common, members of some sort of society or organization, family, I don't know, but geography is irrelevant, right? And I can imagine someone saying, like, no, that's like an interesting idea, but in real life, that's not true. Like, the street in front of my house actually binds us together. Now, I happen to live in a boring neighborhood where no one ever walks on the sidewalks, and it's very sad to walk outside, but that's an accident, right? In fact, we are bound together by some sort of civil responsibility. We vote together, like literally vote together, right? In the same polling stations. We have, if there's a tree that falls, like suddenly we all care about, like, who's going to call 311 to get the city to come remove the tree. Like, there is some sort of obvious way in which being a neighbor still matters, even if it's on like things that we think are not important. They are important, right? We actually live together. The story I started with, like my neighbor said, taking care of the lawn matters to neighbors, whereas whether or not you finish your bathroom inside doesn't actually. Like that's an important point, right? We actually do affect each other in a geographic way. Now, what are the limits to that? So I live in Queens. Do people in Brooklyn matter to me more than people in Teaneck? I don't know why. I mean, they do in some practical way, but certainly there, I think the moral argument gets a lot murkier. But if you mean immediate neighbors, like actual neighbors who live nearby, I think it's easy to see that, like, even despite all of our changes in society, living near someone still really does have an effect, and it means that we're in this together in some way. So that ought to mean, I think this is the whole point of the Mishnah. Once we're in this together, we're responsible to each other. Now we have to figure out what that means. We have to figure out how to divide it. Sure, that's complicated, but we're certainly in this together, and that means we're mutually responsible.
I want to share two comments that I'm seeing as related. So I'll read the first one more or less verbatim. So the person asked, does the principle of helping those you know or those you recognize, going back to that same story, privilege those who are closer with or curry favor with the society's ruling group? In other words, those who are closer to the machers may be better treated than those who aren't. That's one comment. And then there's another comment kind of about the value and responsibility of being part of a community. But I'm actually pulling out of it at this moment the value, right? Like someone who's part of a synagogue community has access to a rabbi's discretionary fund that someone down the street who's unaffiliated but has exactly the same need doesn't. So there's that sort of this the first person is kind of raising this, it's who kind of thing, and what I'm getting from the second one is kind of an arbitrariness, or maybe not. Maybe we're saying like it's if you being part of a community is sort of a prerequisite to to a rising tide lifting all boats.
Yeah, no, I think that's a good formulation. I think it's worth, again, I'm sure many people know the book or have seen the book. This is already an old book, Robert Putnam's Bowling Alone from like 25 years ago, where he documents and laments the fact that membership in sort of micro communities, right? Like more than the 5 people who you live next door, less than the population of New York City, but the 200 people, maybe it's, so the title comes from the bowling leagues. But he has case after case, right? The PTA, writing into your local newspaper, church and synagogue membership. I mean, this is a big one. So he again, documents and laments the massive decline from the 1960s to the 1990s in membership in all of those sort of subgroups, right? These small local groups. So they don't have to be my immediate neighbors, right? I go to the bowling alley that's 2 miles away and I see the same people every Wednesday night. And that's incredibly significant. Now, why is it significant, right? These are the loose ties. They're not my best friends. They don't know much about me, but they're the loose ties that are actually going to help me emotionally, socially, psychologically, and that bowling league might actually help me sometimes if I'm like, oh my gosh, what do I need? So you have where do I turn when I need help? So that might actually be exactly the place where we're able to turn. So synagogues, yeah, absolutely. It is unfair. Again, I mean, going back to the fairness question, right? It's unfair that people with access to the rabbi's discretionary funds have access, and people who never joined the synagogue don't have access. That doesn't make it unjust, right? It's an argument for people being part of communities. Like communities are really, really important. So hopefully people find them. If you're not part of it, there's all sorts of costs you're paying. It's true. On the other hand, to some extent, being part of a community is a cost itself. It's a time cost, it's a social cost, right? You have to invest in other people, sometimes money, like we need to build a city wall, you need to pay for that. But also it means like you're actually caring about other people, and there are benefits to that. So if you invest in a community, the community invests in you. That's not a horrible thing to say. It's actually a pretty good thing to say. It's only sad in our world because not everyone is part of a community. So it's true. It's really hard when you see people and you're like, I know my neighbor, who like has no social network, right? They come home at 5:30, especially now, it's dark outside, the purple glow of the TV is on in that one room upstairs, but like nothing's happening. They just seem to be like all alone, no, nothing going on. It's like, that's really sad. It is sad, but that's an argument for people actually having communities. Like we need that. And it's one of the great tragedies of the last half century or so is the total dissolution of small communities, meaning not small towns, but these communities within towns where people just meet each other in all sorts of ways. So I think it's absolutely true. Obviously, you know, there's a way to abuse this. Like if you just happen to know the right person and they give you a check, that's unfortunate. But, you know, if you're thinking about like, well, you've cultivated that relationship, you know, you've gone to all of these social events every Wednesday night, there's something going on in the synagogue and you go, so people actually know you. Then when you come and you say you need help, you get more of a response than the person whose name is on the membership roster but never showed up to anything. That's what it means to be part of a community, right? You invest in a community and the community is ready to invest in you. It's not, again, it's not the same for everyone, but it's actually not that we should take it away from the people who are getting it as much as that we should try to find ways that everyone can get that, to access those communities.
I think what you're saying is really making me think about, you know, how these, you know, what do we owe our neighbor questions are really connected to the series theme of friendship. You reminded me of kind of a thought piece that I read, I don't know, some months into COVID lockdowns, that was about how much these kind of loose ties, as you refer to them, just how actually massive a role they play in our lives and our well-being. You know, that, you know, if you're the receptionist and the UPS guy who comes every day to pick up the packages, it's like that brief interaction, you know, how are your kids, whatever, like actually really adds to our quality of life. And during COVID, you know, we may have found ways to stay in touch with the people closest to us, and all those other people kind of vanished from our daily lives. And the article was kind of lifting up that as a profound loss. So friendship, I think there are different ways to think about friendship, and maybe that loose ties piece. I think I don't know. It seems
Yeah.
kind of relevant. You know, many fronts that we've been talking about. So let me just raise one more issue before we close. So going back a little bit, a number of people commented on the text, the fact that the community leaders or the townspeople can shift from the kuppah to the tamhui or the other direction, or use it for anything they want. So a number of people raised questions of donor intent and different cases where funds were misused. And I think what, you know, one value that you didn't mention that I think comes out of that text maybe is that of transparency, right? You know, and when someone makes a gift, there should be a clear, you know, if it's a major gift, there should be a gift agreement and everyone should be on the same page. Like, are these restricted funds or are they somewhat fungible? We know we're going to do this program anyway. We'll use that same money you're giving us to pay the electric bill. So maybe that's sort of assuming everyone knows this, you know, this rule put out in Baba Batra, that the community kind of knows, okay, we're empowering the leadership to make these exchanges when necessary. Maybe that's another value that emerges also about transparency. Does that seem like an accurate read to you?
I think so. I mean, you're right. And in a sort of limited scale, it could be clear to everyone that I'm giving to the town. I thought this was the need. If that's the need, then that's the need. I should emphasize that, you know, not everyone agrees. There is this other view that giving to poor people is something totally different. Once it's sanctified for the poor, it can't be redirected. But I think the other view is actually, you know, more interesting because it's so shocking that you can take something that was set aside for the poor and use it for the city gates or something. But yeah, I think you're obviously right, and you know, I think everyone who's ever been involved in any sort of philanthropy knows that this is often a tension, that the needs of the beneficiary are rarely match perfectly the desire of the giver and what they wanted to give for. And you know, today we have all these professionals who are there to navigate that. So like, well, I know you think this is the most important cause, but actually, if we could sort of redirect that a little bit, or, redefine it a little bit, or actually your goals are going to be better accomplished this way. But it's certainly easier on the small scale that we're talking about with a town, where it's like, look, this is our civic responsibility, right? I'm giving to town council. So if you think that's not the most important need, this is the most important need. So I think you're right. Transparency. I think, this is something that we don't have at all. And I'm not sure it's even recoverable, is trust. Like actually assuming that people are going to do the best job they can. I don't assume things are going to be perfect, but in a small town where you know everyone and you actually go to the city council meetings, you can have the trust that they're fundamentally good people who are trying. And that's really tough in our day and age. And once you don't have that, the whole thing is sort of a different ballgame. But if you have that and you're like, well, okay, I really thought we needed a bar on our gate. But if you're telling me that's not the most important, and there's actually something more important, then, if I don't think of you cynically, but think of you trustingly, then that's a conversation that's fairly easy to have. Whereas if it's more professionalized, more distant, and therefore more cynical about what your needs are and my needs, and I don't assume that we're on the same team, then it's a much tougher discussion to have.
So I'm not going to put you on the spot to comment on the war, but I think, and what sort of where our sympathy should lie and where our trust, is placed or misplaced or not placed, in light of these texts. But it does, I do just, just kind of want to acknowledge the degree to which the questions you're raising are really pressing, and I think just front of mind for so many people right now, in terms of the the care that we have for our own larger Jewish community, and and also the care and the pain that we feel for our Jewish community, and then maybe sometimes a more abstract but still very real care and pain that we have and feel for the larger community of civilians being hurt. So and where there are all these forces of anti-Semitism. There's so much on the table right now, complicating all of these questions. So again, I'm not gonna press you to weigh in, but I think I just wanted to name that I think the values that you're pulling out and the questions that the texts raise and that you're highlighting for us are relevant, in many fronts right now, including this kind of major international front that feels so personal to us. You feel free to comment if you want to, but no pressure to. Did you want to say anything else in closing?
No, thank you very much for the interesting and really insightful comments and questions. Great.
Thank you so much for teaching us today. And I meant to say at the beginning that Dr. Kohler was teaching another class elsewhere at JTS, up till 5 minutes before our start time. So he physically ran up to another office. So that's why we started a couple minutes late. So we just appreciate his willingness to pack in the teaching for our JTS students today and our larger community of learning here. I want to wish everyone for those who celebrate, a very happy Thanksgiving later this week, and invite everyone to learn with us again next Monday. Our next session will be with Rabbi Michal Springer, who is an adjunct professor at JTS, and as many of you know, founded our Center for Clinical Pastoral Education here at JTS. She now works full-time in chaplaincy, and her session is called Friendship During Crisis, Learning from the Book of Job. So that is next week. We look forward to seeing you all then. Thanks again for joining us, and thanks again to Dr. Kohler for teaching us today.